Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, we are going way back. Today, we are looking at the cultural phenomenon of Nancy Drew. So I was not a huge Nancy Drew person back in the day. I was a really big Little House person, both actually the television show and also the book series. In fact, not too long ago, I decided that I would do a seminar on the Little House books, and I have to say, I found them not great. There just was a lot in the books. I mean, I absolutely loved them when I was little, but there was a lot that just was not sitting well with me. It was actually very sad. But I'm happy to report that because I was not a huge Nancy Drew lover back in the day, I entered into this question of Nancy Drew from the perspective of a 54-year-old person who studies literature, not someone who is looking back at an old favorite. So much of what we are going to do today is talk about the difference between the original Nancy Drew from the 1930s and the rewritten version of Nancy Drew after 1959. It's absolutely fascinating, this story. It is not one I knew much about, and it was so satisfying to dig into. The reason why I actually even came upon this cultural phenomenon is that I saw a play in New York called The Bookstore. It is about a bookstore, as you might imagine. And in it, one of the employees is talking about how she really loved 1930s Nancy Drew and not so much the rewritten 1960s Nancy Drew. 1930s Nancy Drew she saw as really independent and inspirational. In fact, I think the line in the play was something like she was like a single problem-solving bitch, whereas the later Nancy Drew, the rewritten Nancy Drew, became sort of a Barbie. So I'm really interested in this idea of rewriting things and interested in the legacy of something like Nancy Drew, which actually remains very popular. So those of you who like an agenda, this is what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the publishing history of Nancy Drew. We're going to talk a little bit about the authorship, which was very confusing to me. We're then going to take a look at the prose and the content of the original novels. Then we're going to take a look at how they manifest themselves after having been rewritten. So I found myself even fascinated just by the publication history of these books. It turns out there's something called the Stratemeyer Syndicate, which honestly sounds like, some sort of evil force that we might have found, in Scooby-Doo and that sort of mystery series. But the Stratemeyer Syndicate was actually the gentlemen, I think they're brothers, who were responsible for the Hardy Boys mystery series. So those were at the very end of the 20s. They were so successful that one of the Stratemeyers wanted to create essentially a Hardy Boys for girls. And very satisfyingly, Wikipedia listed all of the names that they thought they might use. And frankly, I like some of these better than Nancy Drew. But some of them were the Stella Strong stories, which I love, the Diana Drew stories, the Nan Nelson stories, the Nan Drew stories, and then the Helen Hale stories, spelled H-A-L-E, like Hale and Hardy. I really like that. I like Helen Hale. In fact, Stella Strong would have been my number one pick, then maybe Helen Hale, and maybe even would have gone in with Diana Drew, perhaps in honor of my mother. I'm going to tell you right now that even Nan Nelson sounds a little better to me than Nan Drew. So the publishers liked Nan Drew best of all of Nan Drew. It's even like kind of hard to say, but they liked that title best out of their choices, but they expanded Nan so that it was Nancy. And in the beginning, when these books were published in 1930, they were not known as the Nancy Drew Mystery Series. In my mind, I always thought of them as like Nancy Drew and the Secret Staircase or whatever it was. But in fact, those of you on the YouTube can see right here, when the books came out originally, it's actually just like this very beautiful dark blue cover, and it has straightforward orange printing at the top. For example, this is the first of all of the books, and it says, The Secret of the Old Clock. It also has the name of the author, Carolyn Keene. So this is important, and again, was really interesting to me. When all of this came up about Nancy Drew and I realized that I was interested in the topic, I went into a local bookstore. I did find a box set of the first 4 of the books. They were definitely versions that had been rewritten in 1959, and in fact, they were rewritten again in 1980. But they also had a book by Carolyn Keene that was called The Nancy Drew Diaries, and it was absolutely, very clearly a book that had been written very much in the modern era. It was published in 2014, and I had this question. I was like, wait, how is Carolyn Keene, who was publishing these books in 1930, still writing them? Those of you who have been long-time listeners to the Fox page know that I had the same experience with Dr. Seuss. So Theodore Geisel, who is in fact Dr. Seuss, he died a long time ago. But just recently, there was suddenly a sequel to The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, which I wanted to hate it, and actually it is not terrible. Those of you who are interested, I did a lecture on it last December. But I was very confused about how Dr. Seuss was able to write a sequel when, of course, I realized that the estate of Dr. Seuss, whatever they're calling themselves these days, were probably very eager to have a sequel. And in fact, I am certain that they own the name, and so they were able to put out this book. The Carolyn Keene thing has even more integrity in some ways because Carolyn Keene was always a pseudonym. So way back when Mr. Stratemeyer decided that he wanted to write some sort of girly analog to the Hardy Boys, he came up with a bunch of outlines and asked a woman named Mildred Wirt, W-I-R-T, Mildred Wirt, to write these first few books. In 1930, 4 of these books that were outlined by Mr. Stratemeyer and were written by Mildred Wirt, they came out, they were published 4 books in 1 year, and they were an immediate success. We don't actually have numbers, but we do know that they were a very high priority of the publishing house. It was Grosset and Dunlap. I also was very interested in my sleuthing. I was very much like Nancy Drew, in fact, recently, that Mildred Wirt then went on to become Mildred Wirt Benson. And, I saw just in the change of the name there, I just saw a whole story unto itself, because you can imagine this very independent young woman. I mean, you would have to have a lot of Nancy Drew in you in order to write, or at least, the desire to be like Nancy Drew, to have written those first 4 books. And you can imagine that perhaps it was a little difficult for Wirt to take the name of this person that she married and to become Mildred Wirt Benson. So right from the start, we have this idea very well established that there will be a pseudonym, Carolyn Keene, who will be the pseudonym for all of the people who will go on to write the Nancy Drew stories. So despite the runaway success of these books in 1930, those books caused a bit of a stir. So Harold Stratemeyer, who was one of the brothers, said that Nancy was too flip and that nobody would want to read about her, and in fact that she needed to be toned down. Happily, Mildred Wirt did not, in fact, take that to heart and wrote about a young woman who was, in fact, very independent and very competent and very capable. There's a writer named Bobby Ann Mason. I actually don't know her work very well. She's from the South. She had problems with Nancy. She said that Nancy was able to have all of these adventures and solve all of these mysteries because she was free, white, and 16. So Nancy Drew in the 1930s books is 16 years old. Later, she is said to be 18 years old. But Bobby Ann Mason has a point there. In 1930, you can imagine that the imperative to get married would have been very, very strong. And in this case, because this young woman is in fact only 16 years old and is not quite marrying age, that she would have the freedom to get up to some stuff and drive around the countryside in her automobile by herself, getting into all sorts of scrapes and then getting herself out of them and solving crazy mysteries all the while. So I think it's very interesting to look at that criticism from Bobby Ann Mason. It is true, and it's very interesting to think of the kind of independence that you would have as a 16-year-old in 1930 as opposed to the expectations that would soon be put upon you. Of course, it's also very important that Nancy was able to do all of this because, in fact, she was white. A lot of the reasons, which we're about to get to, for the books having been rewritten had to do with racism. There were lots of depictions of people of color in the books that were just really difficult to read. They were not, I have to say, as terrible as what I was reading about the Native peoples in the Little House books. And the changes that happened, some of them were simply very practical. It was expensive for them to be publishing these novels. In the beginning, they're about 200 pages long. So there was just this kind of cost-saving thing where they were going to cut down the number of pages. They were just going to sort of economize a little bit. And so the books went from being about 200 pages to 180. That doesn't sound like that much, but I will tell you, I read The Secret of the Old Clock, both in the 30s version and in the 1959 version, and it feels incredibly stripped down, and not in a great way. I really loved, in fact, the richness, all of the connective tissue and all of the excellent prose, some of it very funny, that I found in the 1930s book. So part of the motivation to rewrite these books in 1959 was, in fact, simply economics. They wanted to shorten the books. But also they felt like they needed to modernize some of the slang and some of the terms for things. And there were simply references to things in those early books, simply the objects that were being named. As I said just a minute ago, perhaps the main reason why these books were being rewritten, even in 1959, was this real sense of depicting Black people in particular in ways that were offensive. In The Secret of the Old Clock, there is a scene where we have a Black man he feels very much like a Huck Finn sort of character. He's drinking alcohol. He doesn't seem very smart. It's definitely a depiction that is highly problematic. And in the newer version of The Secret of the Old Clock, he is a white person. They change, instead of having this man be drunk, they have him kind of locked away. So one of the things that was very criticized about the rewritings of these books in 1959 is that they simply took out all of the people of color. And obviously it's better to not have descriptions that are hurtful, but there certainly was quite a bit of criticism leveled this idea of making the books even more white than they already were. I mentioned, in fact, that when I went into the bookstore, I found a very modern book. In 2012, they began a new series called the Nancy Drew Diaries. And in 2004, they had introduced a series called Nancy Drew Girl Detective. So these are books that have been popular, that continue to sell well. I must say that when I was reading them, in the late 70s, they did not, in fact, capture my imagination. I think in part because even in the late 70s, we had a cover of the book that seemed a little bit outdated. It was those kind of hardback books, just like the Hardy Boys books. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put an image of those covers up for you. They're so familiar. We are now going to dive into the text. I have to say, I had such a great time reading these books. I can tell how much I'm enjoying a book when I wake up first thing in the morning. I always think of coffee first, and then right after coffee, I remember what book it is I'm reading, and it's a very palpable feeling, sort of how excited I am about reading it. And I actually was really looking forward to popping out of bed and reading my Nancy Drew. And I have to say, as with all mysteries, I was not reading with an eye toward sleuthing. I didn't have a keen eye out for detail, and I wasn't trying to sort of stay a step ahead and figure out who done it well before Nancy did. But I really just enjoyed the prose. Partially, I was amused by some of the antiquated feel of it, but I also was just very impressed. So we're going to dive in to this version of The Secret of the Old Clock from 1930. We're going to take a look at the prose, and we're going to talk about the work a little bit more generally, just to get to the bottom of why, in fact, these works are so popular. So as I mentioned, those of you on YouTube, it's such an appealing cover, but what might be even more appealing are the incredible end papers. So those of you who are not on YouTube, it's this sort of silhouette kind of thing that we have here. It looks like almost like a paper cutout, and it's a very sort of late 20s, early 30s silhouette of many women with their kind of cloche hats and their longish skirts. And then we have, of course, a detective here who is holding a magnifying glass and is very clearly sleuthing away. It is very interesting to me that even here, we have this idea of Nancy being in a community of a lot of women, but also being by herself and solving the crime. And this idea of the community of women is actually really notable. Throughout the entire book, there are groups of women, there are pairs of women, there are sisters who live together, there are old spinster aunts who live together. Nancy herself has lots of girlfriends, and her father is a very, very important figure in the book. But the predominance of women is actually very notable. Okay, so we're going to dive in. The full title here is Nancy Drew Mystery Stories, The Secret of the Old Clock. And I will alert you to the fact that we begin right away with this conversation. We dive in right en media res, which means simply in the middle of a conversation or in the middle of a sentence. I love books that begin like this because I like the idea of being trusted to figure out what exactly is going on and also diving into something that is already in process. But honestly, it might be a little bit confusing if you didn't know, because it does very much feel like we are entering into the middle of a conversation. It happens to be, we find very quickly, between Nancy and her father. It would be a shame if all that money went to the Tophams. They will fly higher than ever. Nancy Drew, a pretty girl of 16, leaned over the library table and addressed her father, who sat reading a newspaper by the study lamp. "I beg your pardon, Nancy, what were you saying about the Tophams?" Carson Drew, a noted criminal and mystery case lawyer known far and wide for his work as a former district attorney, looked up from his evening paper and smiled indulgently upon his only daughter. Now, as he gave her his respectful attention, he was not particularly concerned with the Richard Topham family, but rather with the rich glow of the lamp upon Nancy's curly golden bob. Not at all the sort of head which one expected to indulge in serious thoughts, he told himself. So there is so much here. First of all, we have the introduction of the father. He's very important. It's in some ways it feels a tiny bit like To Kill a Mockingbird, in that we have this very sort of benign but also very wise father figure who is very respectful of his children and also, in fact, very, very hands-off. So right from the start, though, you also have a sense of these two as collaborating, and the father is having lots and lots of respect for his daughter. So we do, of course, start with that weird thing where he's first noticing her golden bob and her beautiful, head. She's a very attractive young woman. But what's important here, in my opinion, is that he's acknowledging, yes, that she's pretty, and that you wouldn't necessarily expect someone who is so pretty to, in fact, be thinking such big thoughts. So over and over and over again in this book, there's so many examples. We have these very declarative, very clear sentences about about the fact that this very well-esteemed lawyer, Carson Drew, trusts and depends upon Nancy and honestly looks to this 16-year-old as a collaborator, but also as this kind of helpmeet. He sends her on errands to deliver important papers. He asks her opinion about things. They go out to lunch together. He's reassuring, in fact, their lunch partner that Nancy will definitely keep secrets, and she is, in fact, someone who is a repository of some of his secrets. So we have this sense right away of this unusual and very adult connection between father and daughter, a very mutually respectful one. So here, as in many, many books, we have what I think of as like the Bambi effect, which is that the mother has to be out of the picture. So there's this kind of old saw. You even see it, you see it in fairy tales, you see it everywhere, but it's sort of most vivid in some ways in Bambi. This idea that real adventure and real problems cannot ensue until you get the mother out of the picture. So as long as you have like a functioning, well-meaning, capable mother at the helm of any family, we're going to have a lot less problems. As soon as you eliminate the mother, then all sorts of stuff can start to happen. We do not, in fact, have a mother in this picture, and the mother is not missed. You have no sense of angst, you have no sense of sorrow about the mother as not being around. And in the first versions of the books in 1930, there is this woman named Hannah Grun, who is a housekeeper and is, I think, referred to as the maid. And later, in fact, she becomes more a sort of surrogate mother and part of the family. But right from the beginning here, what is highlighted is the fact that Nancy has this close connection with her father, and almost more importantly, that connection is built on her intelligence and her usefulness and her curiosity and her capability and all of her sort of sleuthing skills. So right from the beginning, we have this young woman who is bold and in fact very independent and is sort of speaking with her father on his level. And later we find out, in fact, that they do a lot of collaborating. So this is someone who we know, she's blonde, we know she's pretty at the beginning, but the thing that's more important is the stature that we see her attain at the very beginning. It's also important that we begin with Nancy's voice. So we talk a lot at the Foxed page about whose voice we are hearing. The Nancy Drew stories it's an omniscient third-person narrator who is saying Nancy did this and Carson Drew did that. It's a third-person narration, but we hear lots and lots of dialogue. So we are hearing a lot, not just of Nancy's sort of internal musings, but in fact her voice and what she is saying to other people. It's really important that we are hearing that voice, and she is very outspoken in lots of ways. And it seems very fitting that we begin the very first book of the entire series with her beginning this very important conversation with her father. I was also struck with how much kind of legalese there is in this book. I was trying to think, if I were reading this as a much younger person, sort of a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, if I would understand a lot of what they are talking about. There's conversations about wills and whether or not these things would stand up in court, and there's conversation about loopholes. So I actually very much appreciated the fact that it is not very dumbed down. And of course, like Atticus Finch, we have this Carson Drew as someone who is an attorney and someone who is very concerned with justice and who is able to raise this daughter who is also sort of thinking first and foremost about justice. And then in addition to all of the legalese, which I was actually very impressed by, there also was a time where there's a young woman and she, in order to make money, there's a lot of concern about who has money and who doesn't have money and poverty. I mean, we are 2 years after the stock market crash. I am presuming that all of this is being written in New York City, and you have the country moving into the Great Depression. So you can imagine that there would be a lot of focus and a lot of preoccupation on the idea of who has more resources and who does not. But one of the young women raises chickens and she sells the eggs in order to make some money for their living. She's one of these dyads, one of these pairs of women who live by themselves, these two sisters who live by themselves with no one else and have to really work hard to make ends meet. And she's talking at one point all about the egg market and about the market this and the market that. So I was very actually kind of surprised and impressed that in 1930, in this book that is designed for girls, that in fact we have this real presence of these terms that in fact are very associated with a profession that is traditionally more a male sphere. So I think we all, when we think of Nancy Drew, we think of her intelligence and her resourcefulness and her inquisitive nature and how she's capable of solving things and how she gets herself into some real hot water and is able to get herself right back out of it. But I want to take a closer look here at this kind of shocking independence that she has. So right in the beginning of the 1959 book, we have her driving, and she's driving in her roadster. Again, this speaks to her class. This is a gift that was given to her on her 16th birthday by her father. It is a light blue roadster. There is so much made of the car. It becomes a convertible in 1959, and in fact becomes a hybrid in the 2004 version. But so much is made of the fact that she is able to drive, and she's a very good driver, and she's capable of changing tires by herself. And at one point she's talking about driving into a ditch, and it's sort of like, not that she would need help from someone else, but that would really like make for a long afternoon trying to get the car out of the ditch. So the car, in fact, is very important in lots of ways to show her independence. It's certainly giving her agency. She's driving away from her father. It is the vehicle, literally, with which she is running all of these errands for her father. It also is showing how capable she is. And in 1930, driving would have been somewhat novel. It wasn't that long ago that automobiles were even introduced. It's also another one of these sort of like masculine spheres that she just enters right into. When she's changing the tire, she's talking all about, the jack and the axle. She's very, very comfortable in this world of automotive conveyance. But I want to take a look here at this idea of her independence a little bit more broadly. So this is on page 12 of The Secret of the Old Clock. On the death of her mother 6 years before, she had taken over the entire management of the establishment. The Drews employed one servant, Hannah Grun, an elderly maid of all work who had been with them for many years. The responsibility of the household might have weighed heavily upon Nancy, but she was the type of girl who is capable of accomplishing a great many things in a comparatively short length of time. She enjoyed sports of all kinds, and she found time for clubs and parties. So then the narrator goes on and tells us about how popular she is at school. And although she is very popular, and in fact she has a couple of very close friends, and she has sort of a Watson to her Sherlock Holmes, her name is Helen Corning. But certainly, Nancy is a very independent young woman. So even the wording of how she took over entire domestic responsibility of the establishment, you have this sense of this very adult girl, even though she is only 16 years old. And again, there isn't a lot of sorrow about the mother. And it's actually a little bit surprising because in the books from the 1930s, she's 16 years old and she says that that she lost her mother 6 years before. So she lost her mother when she's like 9 or 10 years old, which would have been a fairly traumatic event, you might imagine. And we see absolutely none of that in Nancy. Notably, in the 1959 books, they move the death of the mother to when Nancy is 3 years old. And I actually think that's kind of smart. I mean, honestly, it feels to me a little bit like Harold Stratemeyer and his syndicate, where like, okay, let's have the mom die when she's 10 and blah, blah, blah. And then perhaps these women who are writing it, who maybe have a slightly better sense of how traumatic it would be to lose your mother, perhaps these authors, who the vast majority were women, were like, hey, let's make the mother die when the child is much younger so that it seems more likely that she would not have been traumatized by this loss. So I also want to take a quick look. This again is at the beginning of the book. The depiction of the father is excellent because he's so great, very much like Atticus Finch. And because he thinks Nancy is so great, then the reader, kind of by association, also thinks that Nancy is great. So we have this paragraph on page 6 of The Secret of the Old Clock. Carson Drew, a widower, showered a great deal of affection upon his daughter. It was his secret boast that he had taught her to think for herself and to think logically. Since he knew that Nancy could be trusted with confidential information, he frequently discussed his interesting cases with her. One of the things that, again, is so interesting to me is these two are real collaborators. I mean, Nancy brings to him this question of this will that they're trying to sort out, but he clearly is talking to her about all sorts of different cases that he has. So we do have this sense not only of her as being elevated in terms of age, but also as like literally being on par with her father, who is this very successful attorney. In addition to this very sort of clear characterization of Nancy as capable and independent, we have a certain sameness to some of the stories in the books. And even within this very first volume, you see a couple of these tropes happen several different times. And all of this is very satisfying. So when I'm talking about the kind of predictability of these tropes, they are made very fresh in the hands of these people, in part because Nancy Drew herself is so compelling, but also because these are very satisfying tropes. And, you know, they're used again and again and again because, in fact, they're very satisfying. So one of those is simply that we have characters who are very villainous. There is not a lot of question. There is not a lot of nuance. In The Secret of the Old Clock, it is Isabel and Ada. Again, we have another pair of sisters here. They are the villains through and through. And in fact, the reason that they are villainous is because they're very spoiled and their father has lots and lots of money. And they are the focus of the book, in fact, because of their greed and how their greed means that they are cheating other people out of their inheritance, which is the wrong that Nancy is trying to right. So we have these very clear villains, and we also have these kind of moral tales that are being told with them. Again, in this case, it was greed, but the villains often feel like they're emblematic of some sort of societal ill. And the way in which the story unfolds, of course, when Nancy is righting the wrong, she is also giving us an alternative to that societal ill. I will say some of the adventures that she gets into seem very unlikely to me. I mean, the craziest things happen to this young woman. But again, I think that's part of the fun. There's a lot of wish fulfillment that happens here. Not only driving around everywhere in the car, but all sorts of exciting things happen to her. And she's not afraid. And she's incredibly capable. And she's always getting herself out of these scrapes. But some of these adventures seem a little over the top. Right at the very beginning of the 1959 version, there's this little girl who's on a stone bridge walking on the handrail, and when this truck goes by, the little girl tumbles over into the river, and of course Nancy saves the girl. So they're not things, it's not like supernatural stuff, but there are things that seem unlikely. But again, I don't think you mind at all because in fact they are very exciting. There are also a huge number of coincidences. We have what feels, in fact, like this very small town that she is living in. And 2 different times, I think, Nancy is shopping in a department store, and she also happens to have Ada and Isabel there at the same time. So there's lots and lots of coincidence. There's lots of people overhearing other people having conversations that are absolutely on point in terms of what the mystery needs. But again, those kinds of coincidences and this kind of heightened sense of adventure, those are things that are very satisfying, especially in a book that is, in fact, made for children. So I want to take another look at the prose. The thing that was absolutely crushing me about the dialogue was all of the adverbs in the glosses. A gloss is simply the words that are the sort of connective tissue in the dialogue, like the he said or she said. And what they will teach you in an MFA program is you want that stuff to just kind of go away. You want to just go with like he said, they said, I said, that kind of thing. But in this case, I can just zip through this very quickly. In 2 pages, we have like 17 different ways to say said. So we have here Grace declared, Nancy suggested, Allie announced, Grace said doubtfully, Allie laughed scornfully, she assured the Horner girls, Grace interposed quickly. I mean, it goes on and on and on. We also have a lot of adverbs, and I don't think a lot of these adverbs are necessary. Adverbs, generally speaking, are not great in writing. You should have enough oomph in the dialogue, or you should have a verb that is strong enough that you don't, in fact, need to use an adverb. And there are lots and lots of adverbs all throughout these books. But again, I think they are very effective, especially if a younger person is reading this book and might not pick up on some of the nuance. So it might be helpful, in fact, to have these signposts. But it really killed me because all of the work is absolutely rife with these verbs for speaking and then also with these adverbs that I really don't think are necessary. So I'm going to list just very briefly some of the basic changes that happen when the books are rewritten in 1959. Instead of being 16 years old, and In the 1930s, she's 16 years old. That was the time when you could graduate from high school. But in 1959, they move her to 18 years old. Her hair goes from being blonde to being Titian, and I honestly didn't know what Titian was, Titian-colored hair. It is, in fact, a very beautiful, if you're watching on the YouTube, it's a very beautiful kind of dark red color. Think of like all the pre-Raphaelites. But I thought that was funny because I appreciate changing her from blonde hair and blue-eyed because that feels sort of cliche. But I also think it is funny that they went with Titian because that is not a term of hair color that is super popular. Again, as I mentioned, instead of having the mother die when Nancy is 9 or 10, the mother dies when Nancy is 3. And in fact, Hannah Grun, who is this elderly maid in the first round of the books, in fact becomes not quite a surrogate mother, but certainly someone who is part of the household. She has dinner with them. She's taking much more care of Nancy. And as I mentioned, the Roadster becomes a convertible. But there are also some things that happen just in terms of those basic changes that people were not wild about. One of the critics said that her tomboyish nature was tamed. There's also a phenomenon where she becomes a little bit more respectful of male authority figures. And by respectful, I mean that she's a little bit more submissive to them. And in fact, her father becomes slightly more protective in a way that I do not think is additive. It's not great. I will say that at one point they're having a discussion, and then the father says something about how she should probably go to bed because it's midnight. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, why are they up talking until midnight? So I think there's probably a little more of that, like going to bed at a somewhat reasonable hour. Although she is, of course, 18, so she's fully capable of staying up until midnight with her father. And now we're going to move on to the actual rewritings in 1959. And here's what I will tell you. It was a major rewriting. When I first read that they were being edited because they wanted to lower the page count, that it was kind of like an economical consideration, I figured that they just would be edited, they would just like take out a bunch of stuff. But this is a major overhauling. So there's a total reorganization. In the 1959 version, we begin with this very exciting moment when Nancy is driving along and the little girl Judy falls off the bridge and into the river, and Nancy has to save the day. And she meets these women who are in fact being bilked out of their inheritance. Whereas in the 1930s, the thing that we jump into is this, it's not a dry conversation that she's having with her father, but it is certainly not as exciting as a small girl falling into a river from a bridge. So we have reorganization that's really significant. If you look at the tables of contents, they're totally different. I mean, this is not just a condensing of a book or an abridgment. This is, in fact, like really redone. There are entire sections, in fact, that are omitted. There's a bunch of stuff that's added that I was like, I'm not sure why they did this. At one point, a big storm comes, and of course, Nancy is a very capable driver, but she has this open top roadster so that, the day gets totally dark and the lightning is hitting the ground all around her, and she drives into this barn, and it happens to belong to this pair of sisters. And it turns out, of course, it is one of their birthdays, and so they have a birthday party. And I'm not totally sure why they, in fact, needed to make it into a birthday party. And I think when I began this lecture, I assumed that there were going to be all sorts of changes that were going to be very stark and that I was going to have a strong opinion about. But these episodes of the shopping are actually emblematic of the ways that there are lots and lots of changes, and lots of them are very important. Certainly removing the racist depictions and getting rid of some of the class stuff, which doesn't necessarily get better in the second version. So there's some very important updates that needed to happen, in my opinion, in order to make these books that we were happy to read. But I did find throughout that it wasn't so cut and dried. There were lots of things about the 1930s edition that I really liked. Again, this kind of richness to the prose, a little more originality in some ways. And it is true that I did not go on and read any of the Nancy Drew books after the 1959 rewrites, but it would be pretty fascinating in some ways to see the changes that they're making and the things that they are really underscoring and developing. So certainly there are a bunch of things in these first two versions that haven't changed at all and that I hope would not change in the future. And that is simply this very independent, very resourceful, really bright and inquisitive and justice-seeking Nancy. And I think in many ways that's probably why these books are able to endure. There was a sneaky statistic I read that said that at one point the Nancy Drew books had outstripped even Agatha Christie's record, but it was in fact for Agatha Christie's hardback sales, which is totally deceiving because I think Agatha Christie has sold like more books than Shakespeare and the Bible. So certainly Nancy is popular, but I don't think she's that popular. So I think I will leave it there. I want to thank you for joining me. It was so fun to take a look at this cultural phenomenon and to think a little bit about how, yes, in many ways, we can look at books like the 1930 versions of Nancy Drew and we can want to preserve them and almost look at them as historical artifacts and at a snapshot of how America was thinking about different things at a certain time: race, class, independence of women, youth, marriage, all of these different questions. And it's very interesting to see the way that they change. But I was also so happy to find that in both of the versions, there was just incredible prose and some really fun stuff to read about adventure and competence and independence. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.